The woman stood on my porch and said the one thing she thought would make me turn away. I can't have children anymore. She said it on a freezing February morning, our breaths fogging white in front of my old wooden house at the end of the road, leading out of Red Hollow, Montana. The sun was just peeking over the hills behind the town like a thin copper streak. I still held my coffee mug in my hand, not having taken a single sip since I opened the door. The wind whipped across the snow-dusted yard, pulling her wool coat tighter around her. But it wasn't the cold that made her shrink back. It was the waiting. Waiting for me to step back. Waiting for me to say one of those polite things men use when they don't want to hurt a woman more but are still pulling away from the story. I looked at her for a long time. Elena Whitaker stood on my porch like someone who had gathered every last bit of courage left in her to come here, just to say the thing that most men in this town would see as an ending. She was 12 years older than me, the CEO of Whitaker Ridge Developments, the company investing in half the redevelopment projects in Red Hollow's downtown. People spoke about her in every tone: respect, envy, curiosity, desire. And me, in that moment, I only saw a woman preparing for rejection like she was more used to it than anyone should be. I smiled. Not the polite social smile, but a smile because I realized what she had just said to me didn't scare me the way she thought it would. Good, I said. Elena blinked. I continued, my voice slow and sure so she couldn't think I was joking. I don't need kids. I need someone who knows how to stay, who knows how to love this house, and who knows how to love the man standing in front of you. For a second, I saw it. The real shock. Not the tabloid kind, but the small, fierce kind that hits when someone braces for rejection and suddenly doesn't get it. Elena looked at me like she was searching for the punchline. She didn't find one. She tightened the scarf at her neck a little more, eyes never leaving mine. Did you hear what I just said? She asked. Clearly. I didn't say it might be difficult. I said I can't. I didn't say I needed that. She exhaled very slowly. Something on her face softened, then pulled itself straight again, like the habit of defense was stronger than the relief that had just flickered through. I thought you should know first, she said, before this goes any further than we can control. Elena, I asked, do you really think we're still at the stage where we can control it? The corner of her mouth twitched, almost a smile but not quite brave enough. Inside the house, the old coffee maker clicked once in the kitchen. The wind rattled through the porch boards, making the birch branches along the fence clack together. I looked at the woman in front of me and thought about how, a year ago, if someone had told me the CEO 12 years older than me would be standing on my porch confessing the most private thing in her life, I would have laughed in their face. Because a year ago, my life had been very different. My name is Tyler Brooks, 27 years old, dark blonde hair, white skin, living in the old wooden house at the edge of Red Hollow. I run Brooks Timber and Feed, the family feed store and lumberyard. The town calls me the young Brooks kid, the way people label a man old enough to carry the family load, but still not fully out from under his father's shadow. My dad died of a heart attack right in the warehouse 2 years ago. Since then, I've taken over everything. The books, the lumber trucks, the hay contracts, the crew that forgets shifts, the debts, the leaky roof on the shed, and the house my mother left after she couldn't stand every corner reminding her of him. I'm not the dreamy type. I work before the sun comes up, drink my coffee black, fix what's broken, drive a dusty pickup, know the price of winter hay and which wood splits least when the snow falls. I was engaged at 24 to Mara, a girl from Billings, pretty, young, sweet, and always talking about real life, like Red Hollow was just a temporary stop for people who hadn't grown up yet. We broke up after she said something I still remember. I don't want to spend my life in a place where people measure the future by how many more winters they can survive. I was angry then. Later, I realized she was just being more honest than I was. Then Elena came to town. Not like some movie where the female CEO shows up and everything stops. It was more ordinary and more dangerous. She appeared at a town council meeting about redeveloping the abandoned storefronts on the square. Navy suit, chestnut hair pulled low, voice calm enough that the men who usually talked over women in Red Hollow actually sat still and listened. What caught me first wasn't that she was beautiful, though she was. It was that she didn't try to be friendly the way city people usually fake it in small towns. She didn't smile to win anyone over, didn't pretend to love the rustic stuff, didn't soften her tone. She spoke straight, numbers clean, looked every person in the eye, and when old Kurt Barlow hinted that women from the city never understand the soul of a mountain town, Elena simply said, "The soul doesn't pay to fix rotting roofs, Mr. Barlow. The people living here do." The room went dead quiet. I laughed. She heard it. She looked at me for exactly 1 second. Just 1 second. But it was enough to stay with me all week. After that, we ran into each other a few times because of work. Her company hired my yard to supply treated pine for the new shops. She called me directly instead of letting an assistant do it. Her questions were short, clear, no circling. One afternoon, she drove out herself, stood in the slanting light beside stacks of lumber, black coat dusted with a thin layer of snow, and asked me, "Do you always check every load yourself? I don't like other people ruining something that carries my family name." She nodded like she understood that sentence more than an outsider should. Neither do I. From there, a kind of recognition started forming. We drank coffee after late meetings. She asked about my dad. I asked why someone like her would pick Red Hollow. She said because towns like this could still be saved if someone was stubborn enough to stay. I said she sounded like she was talking about people more than real estate. She looked at me over the rim of her cup and answered, "Maybe the two aren't as different as you think." I was drawn to her early, and because of that I tried even harder to keep distance. She was older, richer, better educated, had lived in New York, Chicago, Denver, places where even in my best shirt I would still be seen as a man from a small life. And there was the town itself. Red Hollow ran on lumber, cattle, gossip, and memory. So when things between us started tilting away from pure business, I knew there would come a day when Elena would have to say something. I just never expected the thing she chose to say would be about children. She looked up at me again. "You might think it over and change your mind later," she said. "I just didn't want you walking into this under any misunderstanding." I set my coffee mug on the wooden railing and took one step closer. "Listen to me," I said. "If anything is pulling me towards you, it has never been the thought of a child that doesn't exist." Elena looked at me for a long time. Then she asked, almost whispering, "Then what is it?" I answered with the truth. "It's you." And that was the moment I knew, whether I wanted it or not, the story between me and this woman had already gone too far to turn back. Elena didn't come inside my house that morning. She just stood on the porch for a few more minutes, as if forcing herself to believe the conversation had really happened, then tightened her scarf, took a slow breath, and said, "I have a meeting with investors in Bozeman tonight, but I'm free tomorrow after 6. I looked at her. "Sounds like you're scheduling a date." "I run a company," she answered, her lips curving up just a little. "I schedule everything. So, tomorrow night at 6. You cooking?" "Only if you want to survive." This time she laughed for real. "Then I'll bring the food." When her car pulled out of the yard, I stood there a long time, my hands freezing because I had forgotten to pick up the coffee mug again. I wasn't naive. I knew the words, "I can't have children anymore," weren't just a medical fact. For a woman older than me, especially one so successful and used to being measured by crooked standards, that sentence carried a whole history of being judged, pitied, and seen as incomplete. The fact that she told me wasn't a test. It was giving me a polite chance to walk away. I hadn't taken it. And that made me more restless that whole day than any load of lumber I had ever hauled. The next evening, Elena arrived at exactly 6:07. She brought a box of Italian food from the only decent restaurant within 50 miles, a bottle of red wine, and her usual calm expression. But this time, there was something softer in her eyes. "I figured you shouldn't ruin the first impression by burning your own steak," she said as she stepped into my kitchen. I pretended to be offended. "I feel insulted." "Good, that means you're still normal." Dinner happened at my parents' old wooden table under the dim yellow light I still hadn't replaced. There were no candles, no music, nothing that resembled a fancy date from the movies. Just hot pasta, red wine, the sound of wind scraping against the windows, and two people sitting across from each other in a kitchen that had been empty for too long. Elena told me about her marriage. She had been 32 when she married Daniel Cross, a real estate investor in Chicago. They lasted 4 years. The divorce came after she had to have a complete hysterectomy due to severe complications that doctors had first thought were just fibroids. She didn't go into too many details. She told me just enough. But it was enough for me to understand that the deepest pain wasn't only losing the ability to have children, it was everything that came after. "Daniel said he didn't blame me," Elena told me, staring down at her wine glass. "Then 3 months later, he moved in with a younger woman he called someone who could give him a more complete life." My blood ran cold. "Piece of shit." She shrugged with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "People rarely call themselves pieces of shit. They just call it being honest." I looked at the woman across from me and saw clearly how she kept her back straight, even while talking about something that had once broken her. She wasn't speaking with tragedy in her voice. She wasn't asking for pity, and that was exactly what hurt me. So after that, you stopped serious dating? She finished for me. Yeah. There were a few attempts, she said with a bitter laugh. But most men over 40 in my world want two things: a woman beautiful enough to stand beside them at parties, and the ability to give them a child if they don't already have one. I still had the first. I lost the second. I set my fork down. I hate how your world talks about women like they're a list of features. Elena looked up at me longer than usual. You're not saying these things just to make me feel better, are you? No. You actually mean them? Yes. Something in her face softened. Not full trust yet. Just the decision not to fight it anymore. We didn't kiss that night. But when she stood on the porch getting ready to leave, snow had started falling. I held her car door open and we both paused in that half-step space that was too close for politeness and too far for intimacy. Tyler, she said quietly, using my name that way for the first time. Are you sure? About what? About stepping closer to me like this? I smiled lightly. No. She blinked, probably not used to a man admitting that. I'm only sure of one thing, I continued. I still want to keep stepping closer. She looked at me for a long time, then touched her fingertips to my wrist. Just a brief touch, but it made my heartbeat stumble. Sleep well, she said. From that night, the rhythm of our lives began to change. Elena started coming by the lumberyard more often, even though she could have sent her manager. I found reasons to visit her temporary office in the town square. We had Saturday morning coffee, late Wednesday dinners. We walked the piece of land she planned to turn into a small community park beside the creek at the edge of town. Some nights we just sat in her car on the hill, looking at the distant lights of Red Hollow and talking about things that had nothing to do with business. I learned she liked old jazz when driving at night. She learned I still kept my father's fountain pen, even though the ink had dried up long ago. I learned she hated going to gynecologist appointments so much that she became unusually quiet every time one approached. She learned I hated leaving a conversation before everything on my mind had been said. And I began to see the cracks she hid so carefully. How sensitive she was to casual comments like, "You'll understand when you have kids someday." And the way she unconsciously touched the faint scar on her lower stomach whenever she felt alone. The closer I got to her, the more certain I became of one thing. What pulled me toward Elena had never been the age difference or her beauty as some kind of fantasy. It was the way she had walked through loss and still stood straight. The way she was both strong and fragile at the same time. And the way, in the rarest moments, she let me see the real woman beneath all that steel. One night at the end of February, we were standing inside an old model home in town, the one she planned to convert into a community office, when her phone rang. The name on the screen read, Margaret Thornton. Elena turned the screen off immediately. I asked who it was. She exhaled. The owner of Thornton Ranch, the richest widow in the county. She's trying to team up with Eastern investors to buy your family's land cheaper. I frowned. What does that have to do with you? She wants me to partner with her. I refused. I didn't ask more questions, but it was the first time I clearly saw the shadow of other forces standing outside our story. And I knew Red Hollow wasn't going to let two people like us stay peaceful for long. The rumors in Red Hollow didn't explode like fire. They crept in like smoke. At first it was just the glances that lasted a second too long at Miller's Diner. Then a few jokes shouted a little too loud among the crew at the lumberyard. CEO from the city got a taste for young Pine Brooks? One of the older guys called out while we unloaded a truck. I laughed it off or changed the subject. But the jokes slowly turned sharper, less playful. Mrs. Ruth Calloway at the grocery store started looking at me like I was selling out the family name to some city woman who didn't belong. Old Kurt Barlow said it straight to my face one afternoon outside the feed store. Women like that don't stay in places like this, son. They use what they need and move on. I kept my mouth shut, but inside my jaw stayed tight the rest of the day. The real explosion came on a Sunday dinner at my mother's house. She had come back to Red Hollow for a few weeks at a time after I took over the yard, staying in the old bedroom upstairs. She wasn't cruel, and she wasn't the closed-minded type who couldn't be reasoned with, but she was a woman of this town, and that came with its own set of beliefs. It was just me, Mom, and Aunt Lorraine that night. We ate roasted chicken and potatoes, the same dishes that always brought back memories of Dad sitting at the head of the table. Dessert was halfway through when Aunt Lorraine set her fork down like she had just remembered something casual. Heard you've been spending a lot of time with that Whitaker woman. I looked up. And Elena? Yeah, her. Mom didn't meet my eyes, still slicing her apple pie. People are talking quite a bit now. Because people have too much free time, I answered. Aunt Lorraine gave a laugh that had no humor in it. Tyler, honey, we're just thinking, Women like her don't come to towns like Red Hollow for real reasons. Women like her? Rich, older, powerful, from the city, and she paused long enough for it to sting. With certain limitations. Mom finally looked up. Lorraine. But it was already out. You're talking about the fact she can't have kids? Aunt Lorraine wore the face of someone caught but still convinced she was right. I'm just saying you should know what you're giving up. Something inside me went quiet before it turned hot. Dad had died right in this house. I had given up dreams to stay here and keep Brooks Timber and feed from collapsing. I worked like a mule every single day, and somehow none of that was enough for them to let me choose my own life. I set my fork down gently. I'm not giving anything up, I said. I'm choosing. Mom opened her mouth to smooth things over. Tyler, I'm not against her. You just think I should pick someone who fits what this town expects, right? The silence that followed hurt worse than any argument. I left right after that, drove straight to Elena's house without calling first. She was in the kitchen wearing a white button-down with the sleeves rolled up, glasses sliding down her nose while she read through some files. One look at my face and she knew. Your mother? I nodded. She let out a quiet breath and set the papers down. I'm sorry. Don't ever say that when other people are the ones who should be apologizing. She stepped close until she stood right in front of me, the smell of cooling coffee and pine from the fireplace between us. Tyler, this is the price that comes with being near me. I've always known that. No, I told her, looking straight into her eyes. This is the price they are trying to make you pay for not fitting their mold. It's completely different. She didn't answer right away, just looked at me long enough that I could see the exhaustion in her eyes. I thought this would happen sooner, she said softly. Red Hollow can accept me as the CEO bringing money in. But as the woman stepping into the life of one of their young men? No. So what are you planning to do about it? She turned half away and rested her hands on the counter. The sensible thing. A cold feeling ran down my spine. Say that clearer. Elena stayed quiet a few seconds, then spoke. Maybe we should slow down. I felt like I'd been punched in the chest. Slow down because you need time, I said. Or because they want you to? She didn't answer immediately, and that silence was the answer itself. I stepped closer. Elena. Finally, she turned back. I don't want to be the reason you fight with your family. Too late. You're not the reason. They are. And I don't want the day to come when you wake up and realize you traded too much just to stand beside someone like me. I gave a short, painful laugh. Someone like you? You know what I mean. No, say it. Older than you, unable to have children, messy past, seen by this town as an outsider. Her voice stayed calm, but her eyes didn't. Someone you'll always have to explain. I looked at her for a long time. Then I spoke slowly. The only thing that tires me is the way you still think you're a burden. Elena closed her eyes like the words had hit the exact spot where she was weakest. I never said I was a burden. You act like it. For the first time since we met, the silence between us turned sharp. She stepped back half a pace. Maybe I should give you time. No, you're giving the whole town the right to decide for me. I left after that because if I stayed any longer, I was afraid I would say something even more painful. On the drive home, snow started falling again. I drove slowly past the square, past the church lights and closed shops and the diner, with a few faces still behind the glass. Red Hollow was still the town I grew up in, but for the first time I saw it like a narrow trap. 3 days passed and Elena didn't text. I didn't either. The next 4 days I threw myself into work until I was exhausted, hoping my head would finally quiet. It didn't. Friday night I found myself driving out to the old cemetery on the hill without planning to. Dad was buried there. Next to his plot was the empty grave Mom had bought years ago when they still thought they would grow old together in Red Hollow. I stood in the cold wind with my hands in my coat pockets, staring at his name on the stone and remembering the thing he once told me when I was 19 after my first heartbreak. Son, some people you lose because of timing. Others you lose because you let someone else speak your fear for you. I stood there a long time, until I understood the scariest thing wasn't what the town would say. It was the possibility that I might let a woman who had already been rejected too many times believe one more time that she wasn't worth standing up for. And I knew exactly what I had to do. Sunday morning at St. Luke's Church was more crowded than usual because it was the day of the fundraiser for fixing the community center roof. Red Hollow had this strange habit. The people who liked to judge the most also liked to sit in the front rows as if God would notice them faster. I wasn't someone who went to church every Sunday like my mom. But that day, I went. Not just went. I wore my father's white shirt, the cleanest brown jacket I owned, and arrived early enough to see Margaret Thornton, Aunt Lorraine, my mom, Kurt Barlow, and almost everyone who had an opinion about my life in the last few weeks. Elena wasn't there. She didn't go to St. Luke's. She had once told me she wasn't fake enough to sit quietly listening to people talk about compassion and then go outside and tear each other apart. The service was almost over when Pastor Harold Walsh invited everyone to stand for the final hymn. I couldn't sing more than half the words. My heart was pounding like I was about to step into a fight. When the song ended, I stood up before anyone else could sit down. The sound of wooden pews creaking filled the church. Pastor Walsh looked at me. "Tyler?" I turned to face the entire room. My hands were cold, my throat dry, but my voice came out steadier than I expected. "I know this isn't part of the program this morning," I said, "but there's something that needs to be said in exactly this place." The church fell silent. I saw my mom look up. Aunt Lorraine frowned. Margaret Thornton pressed her lips together like she already knew she wouldn't like what was coming. "I let other people's words come between me and the woman I love," I continued, "and I'm not letting it happen for one more day." A small murmur spread through the pews. Elena Whitaker doesn't need anyone in this church to pity her because she can't have children. She doesn't need anyone to judge her for her age, her past, or the city she came from. I clenched my hands behind my back to stop them from shaking. She is strong, kind, and smarter than most men I've ever worked with. And the only thing that should be shameful in this story is the way this town has treated a woman, just because she doesn't fit what everyone calls normal. Pastor Walsh didn't interrupt. No one did. I looked toward my mom. "I don't need a woman to give me what other people think is the right kind of future," I said. "I need someone who makes me want to wake up tomorrow with her. And that's Elena." Aunt Lorraine opened her mouth, but Pastor Walsh just tilted his head and she stayed quiet. I looked straight at Margaret Thornton. And I'll say one more thing clearly. If anyone uses the fact that she can't have children to think she's worth less, then that person doesn't understand anything about family, love, or kindness. A heavy silence fell over the church like snow on the roof. Then from the back pew, old Mr. Moses Garrett, the oldest man in town, slowly stood up with his wooden cane. "I buried my wife 30 years ago," he said, his voice rough but clear. "And if there's one thing I learned in over 40 years with her, it's that a home doesn't stand because of how many children run through it. It stands because two people choose each other every single day." He turned toward me. "If you've chosen, son, don't let the crowd make you small." His words dropped like a stone into still water. Then a few people nodded, then a few more. Not everyone. I didn't need everyone. I only needed enough to cut the rope of shame the town had been trying to tie around her. After the service, my mom walked straight up to me on the church steps. She stood very close, her eyes redder than usual. "I didn't want to hurt you," she said. "But you did," I answered, not loud, just straight. She nodded, accepting it. "I know. I've lived here too long and sometimes forgot what's my fear and what's yours." She touched my sleeve lightly. "If you really love her, bring her to dinner. Let me apologize properly." I looked at her for a long time, not forgiving everything right then, but not pushing her away either. "I'll tell her," I said. Then I left the church, got in my truck, and drove straight to Elena's house. She was on the back porch alone with a cup of tea that had gone cold, wearing a wine-colored sweater, her hair tied loosely. When she saw my truck, she stood up slowly, like she had guessed something but didn't dare believe it. I walked up the steps. No greeting, no circling. "I just did something you might hate." Elena frowned. "Doesn't sound promising." I stood up and spoke in the middle of church. She froze. "You did what?" "I told everyone I love you. I said you don't need anyone's pity. I said anyone who uses the fact you can't have children to judge you doesn't understand a damn thing about family." Elena looked at me like the whole world had tilted a few degrees. Her fingers tightened around the cup. Her eyes started to water before she even realized it. "Tyler." "Don't," I said, shaking my head. "This time, don't be the one who speaks." I did. I stepped closer. "You can hate what I did. You can think it was too much, too public, too red hollow. But I couldn't stand the thought of you pulling away from me because you thought you were saving me from the gossip. You don't save me by taking yourself out of the picture." Elena set the cup down on the porch table like she was afraid she might drop it. You really said all that in front of everyone?" "Yes." "Why?" I gave a short laugh. "Because you deserve to have someone stand up for you at least once in your life." The tears came then. Not many, just a few drops. But for a woman like Elena, that was already a flood. She stepped forward and hugged me so hard I almost rocked back half a step. I held her tight, arms around her waist, feeling her heartbeat racing through the thin sweater. I got so used to protecting myself that I forgot what it feels like when someone else does it for me, she whispered against my neck. I kissed her hair. Then start remembering. She looked up, eyes red, lips trembling. But for the first time since that freezing morning, she stood on my porch confessing she couldn't have children. I didn't see any preparation for being left in her eyes anymore. Only surprise. And a real softness. Then she kissed me. Right there on the porch, in the cold sunlight and the smell of melting snow. Not careful, not testing, but the kiss of someone who had finally stopped waiting to be rejected. When we pulled apart, she whispered, "You really made sure I can't back out now." I smiled. Good. 3 months later, the town of Red Hollow still had people who didn't like us. But that was no longer what decided our story. Elena began staying at my house more and more. At first it was just weekends, then a few weeknights, then one drawer in the bathroom held her toothbrush, then her coat hung next to mine by the back door. Then her laptop sat beside my lumberyard ledger on the kitchen table like the two things had always belonged together. Our life wasn't some fairy tale miracle. It was something better because it was so ordinary. Mornings, she would join video calls with Denver in a crisp suit from the waist up while wearing my sweatpants below. Afternoons, I would come home from hauling lumber and find her standing in the yard talking to the landscaping crew like she had lived in Red Hollow her whole life. Evenings, we would argue about her working too late, then make up over chili that was always too spicy. Some nights, she would sit in the yard watching me build cabinets and say, "You know, a man who's good with his hands is always dangerous." I would ask why, and she would answer, "Because he makes a woman forget she ever planned to protect herself forever." My mother kept her word. She invited Elena to dinner. It wasn't perfect. There was awkwardness, long silences, and cracks that still needed mending. But somewhere between the roasted chicken and the old family tablecloth, my mother finally said, "You don't have to forgive me right away, but I want you to know I was wrong." Elena looked at her for a long time and replied, "I don't need you to be perfect. I just need you to be honest." I sat there understanding that sometimes grown-ups only have to stop defending themselves to show love. Elena's company stayed busy. My lumberyard never slowed down. We were both tired. We both had pasts. We were no longer at the age where love lived on dreams. And maybe that was exactly why what we had grew stronger every day. One evening at the beginning of May, after the whole town had gone to sleep, we sat on the porch with 2 glasses of iced tea, listening to frogs from the ditch behind the house, and watching fireflies rise around the fence. Elena rested her head on my shoulder. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked. "I regret a lot of things." "Which one do you mean?" "The fact that I can't give you children." I turned to look at her. The porch light caught her face and softened every line that had once looked so sharp. I knew the question wasn't only for me. It was the old piece of her that still rose sometimes, wondering if this happiness was missing a part. "No," I answered. She waited. I continued. "I regret that anyone ever made you think that defined your worth." "But the fact itself?" "No." I took her hand. A family doesn't start with a baby's cry. It starts with 2 people deciding every morning they will still turn toward each other. Elena stayed quiet a long time. Then she smiled through wet eyes. "You say things like that, and it's too dangerous for an older woman." "I thought you liked danger." She swatted my arm lightly and pressed closer. A week later, we drove out to the empty land near the creek, where her first community park was about to break ground. The grass was already knee-high, the May sun warm but not harsh, and the smell of fresh earth and running water mixed together. Elena stood in the middle of the plot with her hands on her hips, hair blowing in the breeze, telling me about the little outdoor library she wanted in the east corner, the benches made of pine, the stone path that would curve through native trees. I listened for a while, but then stopped hearing the words because I was too busy watching the way she lit up when she talked about something she wanted to build. When she paused and asked, "Are you even listening?" I answered honestly, "Yes and no." Elena narrowed her eyes. "Explain." I pulled a small wooden box from my coat pocket. She went completely still. "Tyler, wait. Let me speak before you cut me off with one of those perfectly logical arguments of yours." She laughed in surprise, then the tears came so fast she looked shocked by them herself. I opened the box. Inside wasn't a flashy diamond, just a simple white gold band with a small gray-green stone in the center, the exact color of her eyes at dusk. "I can't give you a bigger city or a life with less gossip," I said. but I can give you a home where you never have to prove your value. A man who will never use your pain as an excuse to step back. And a life where whether or not you can have children will never be the question that decides anything. I took a breath. Elena Whitaker, will you marry me? She cried for real then. Hand over her mouth, shoulders shaking. The woman who had once stood on my porch in February ready to be rejected was now standing in the middle of sunlit ground in May, unable to speak, because she had finally been chosen in the most complete way possible. At last she nodded. Yes. Then she laughed through the tears. God, yes. I slipped the ring on her finger. She wrapped her arms around my neck. We stood in the middle of land that had nothing built on it yet, but I already knew it was the beginning of home. That night when we got back to the house, we passed the mirror in the hallway. Elena stopped and looked at our reflection, then at the ring on her hand. You know, she said very softly, the morning I stood on your porch and told you I couldn't have children anymore, I had already prepared myself to lose you. I wrapped my arms around her from behind, chin on her shoulder. I know. I didn't understand why you smiled. Do you understand now? She turned inside my arms, eyes still wet but mouth smiling. Yes. Because what you wanted was never some empty space that needed to be filled by a child. I kissed her forehead. It was you. You finally got good at this. She laughed. Outside the window, Red Hollow lay quiet under the night. The town hadn't suddenly become perfect. People hadn't stopped looking, talking, or comparing. But from now on, those things were no longer the center. The center was this lit-up house, the 2 cups of coffee waiting on the porch every morning, the park blueprints lying beside my order sheets, the woman who once thought she was missing something now wearing my ring and learning to believe she had never been missing anything at all. And me, the small-town man who never thought he would love a city CEO this much, now seeing it as the most natural thing in the world. If anyone ever asked me when I knew for sure, I wouldn't say it was the moment I proposed. It wouldn't be the kiss on the porch either. It would be that freezing February morning when Elena said, I can't have children anymore. And I understood that for some people the right answer isn't regret. It's taking one more step. Because some families don't begin with blood. They begin with a choice so clear it echoes, I choose you. And this time you never have to apologize for anything again.